Hey guys, and welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today, Ash and myself are taking a very deep dive into everything you need to know about sitting down and standing back up again. Whether it's a body weight version, using weights, we're going to dive deep into the squat and all things squat mechanics. But I don't know if you've heard, but we've got a 4 best deadlift accessories. So if you head over to our website, lungeandlift.com, you can download a free PDF with those 4 deadlift accessories you're not doing, and that will hopefully improve your deadlift. So yes, this is a squat episode, but we can also help your deadlift by heading over there. And as always, if you want to get some discount off of some good sports kit, head over to our other show sponsor, Wit Fitness, and check out the store in New Change and online at www.wit-fitness.com and use the code LL15. You get 15% off your purchase. And we also have our Hydro sponsor, which is the blood flow restriction apparel. I've recently finished a 30-day arm challenge utilizing their top, and got some very good results with that. So if you want to read more about that, you can head over to my website, robsaspt.com, and read the blog post I did about that. And if you want to save yourself 20% off one of their tops, use the code LL20 and save yourself 20%. So, Ash, what is a squat?
Good question, mate. It is pretty much sitting down, standing back up again in its simplest form. And I think if we're to get a little bit more technical about it, let's reference the deadlift episode we did, because we dig a little bit deeper into the distinction between a squat and the hinge pattern. Essentially, they're very overlapping. But for me, what makes a squat is that it's primarily focused on vertical displacement down of the pelvis. So basically, your hips travel towards the floor a lot more than they would do in a hinge pattern, although it happens in both. And I think the other thing that characterizes a squat over a deadlift is that there's a much more equal amount of knee and hip flexion. So there's a similar amount of folding at the hip and knee bending to get your body lower, essentially.
Is there?
Is there?
Because I'm just thinking about something like a low bar squat where I'm a lot more hip dominant compared to knee flexion. So essentially, it's more of a deadlift, which is the thing. And I guess I know we're going to dive deeper today into it, but where we got people like talking about either doing above parallel squats for power and strength, and you got people talking about going the complete other end of the spectrum of knees over toes. So like this, obviously, the vertical displacement going up and down is obviously like the main thing there, but I guess it does depend on how low you go, depends on how much of a squat it is. Is that right?
Yeah, it is a matter of opinion, not fact. So there's lots of different styles of squats, but in terms of general rules of thumb, those would be the typical characteristics that distinguish it from a hinge. But you're spot on in that they are very similar, and depending on what variation, like some people have a very leg pressy deadlift where they use a lot of knee bend, knees come forwards even over toes for some people, which may or may not be great. Like if you're a trap bar deadlift, can look exactly like a squat. It's just like a suitcase loaded squat, really. So the point at which one becomes another, I think, is arbitrary. But for the purposes of the podcast, I think anything that's typically called a squat will focus on the vertical displacement down of the pelvis, and the amount of relative knee and hip flexion is very much down to the variation you choose in your style of squatting.
That's right. And so when we're discussing, obviously, as you say, squats, so are we just talking about mainly like loaded squats and bodyweight squats, or are we talking about the squat pattern and like things like jump in and stuff like that, where we are getting into that similar sort of thing of hip flexion and knee flexion at the same time?
Yeah, all of the above. We'll cover it all.
Brilliant. Okay, then. So I guess the big question is, should you squat? And if you should, why should you squat?
Yeah, so I think most people agree that squatting is a pretty fundamental movement pattern. Nowadays, especially more than ever, sitting to standing is a huge part of what we do, mostly sitting. And it's something that typically becomes a challenge as we age. So, old people can struggle to get in and out of their chairs. So the logic goes that we should train our squat pattern to make sure that we retain the ability to get in and out of chairs on and off the toilet. However, at the other end of the spectrum, for the athletes and the elite performers, it carries over very well to jumping, and it's a great way to build leg strength for a whole variety of different tasks, like picking up ovens or heavy stuff like that. And anything you want to use your lower body for. So there's plenty of good reasons why you should squat, including growing bigger legs as well.
Yeah. So is there any reasons why you shouldn't squat though? Because I guess being such a fundamental movement pattern of life, just before I actually ask that question, it's funny because whenever I think back to, I think about an old person getting out of a seat. Have you noticed the seat is always a really soft, like laid back sofa seat? Like, why would you get into that kind of seat if you know you might not get out? Surely you'd get into a bit more like a stool or something like that, where you're a bit more upright, give you the opportunity to get out the seat.
Yeah, it's comfy, mate. I think that's why.
I know, but if you might not get out, that might be it. So, but yeah. So as a thing, do you think that everyone should squat? Really? Do you think we should?
I think most people would benefit from it, but like we said in our sort of what is fitness episode, it depends what you want to use your body for. And I think a lot of people would be quite dogmatic about the fact that anyone who goes to the gym should have a squat pattern in their program. I'm actually less precious about that, and like I don't really have any like typical squats in my own training because I train my legs with lots of other different movements. And my stance on like the most fundamental and king of exercise is obviously going to be the lunge. For me, that has more carryover to life. We get in and out of a chair like X number of times per day, but the number of steps we take is hopefully around 10,000. So, excuse me. So training your gait, there's so many other benefits of doing lunges in terms of like the stability and sequencing going from one foot to the other, that I think it has more carryover to life as a personal opinion. But generally, most people would really benefit from squatting. Like I get my mum to squat because I want her to be able to get in and out of the chairs as she gets older. So yeah, that's my stance, mate. What do you think?
Well, I think I think everyone should squat. I know obviously you mentioned there about lunges being maybe superior. I agree to some respect, obviously, because I think especially in younger years, I think obviously that is because we are a lot more locomotive. We do move around a lot more. And when you get older, you should try and still keep moving as much as possible. So that's really important. But I definitely then feel the demand that you're asking for an older person, maybe that bit more, especially if they're not exposed to that much single leg movement, that a squat is a good like bang for buck time that you're going to get the most out of it, because they can probably do that at a more challenging way. But for me, I think where I get a little bit of a, not gripe, but where people think squatting and the fact that we should all squat needs to be a back squat. That's I think when we start getting to nuance of particular squats, that's where I think my biggest issue is, for when people say that that's the option, where I beg to differ, and I think most people do not need to back squat. That's probably far from it. Back squat is a great option, and unless you're a power lifter and not maybe a weightlifter, then back squatting, even weightlifting, I'll say you don't need it, but it's a front squat. But yeah, so for me, that's really just my thoughts. I do agree with the lunging thing, but I definitely think that we, as a functional athlete, shall we say, someone that likes to do many things, I think lunging has the best carryover for everything, because you have so many benefits of the movement pattern, and you are then still challenging all the similar muscles of a squat anyway, plus some extras. So
yeah, I think you make a good point there that the squat is easier to overload the muscles because you're static, you're in bilateral even stance, you have more stability. So to challenge the strength of the muscles is slightly easier. But yeah, I think the counterpoint to that is that you remove the need to generate your own stability that you would need to in a lunge. So that's sort of the trade-off there. You're looking to maximally challenge your strength versus strengthen everything in a little bit more proportion. in which case I'd go for the lunge as having.
Yeah, and I guess as a nice even ground, I'd probably then go for a supported static split squat. So because then it takes away the need for necessarily the balance side of it, but then you can unilaterally load each individual leg. So then you're getting the best of both worlds. So then you, just because I'm just trying to now play devil's advocate of, if you've just started training someone that's a little bit older and they've just started moving, that then to maybe, well, as I think if you've been coaching long enough, you know you can't necessarily just jump straight into, say, a walking lunge, but it's you obviously progress up the chain from it. But the idea that maybe a static split squat is a really good way to progress, which is, it's essentially a lunge anyway. It's just the wording, right?
No.
I know it's not. I know, because lunge is locomotive. So that's my word of the day, locomotive. I've used it twice now in the space of 5 minutes. So obviously, I guess both of us, and particularly you, since you are a movement specialist, what would you say are some key features of a good squat? And also, what are some common things that you tend to see that people fuck up on?
I don't think anyone really fucks it up. I think the perfect squat's like the holy grail in that no one ever achieves it. There's never a squat that's, absolutely perfect in every single way. There's always things that could be better. But in terms of key features, I think one of the talking points today is depth, because it's something that has changed over the years in terms of what you should do in a squat. For a long time, people thought you shouldn't squat below parallel, or you should squat just to parallel, otherwise your knees would explode. And nowadays, the more prevailing opinion is that you should always squat arse to grass, and that maximum depth is what you should do. And then there's some other coaches out there who now think that they're sort of going back to 90 degrees or not even to parallel, and they think that's better. I think my stance on this is that, like a lot of things, the extremes are what gets notoriety. So the people who are like, yeah, definitely squat all the way to the floor, or people who say don't squat below 90 or 290, they're more sensational opinions and points of view, when actually they're just opinions and there's no facts around what you should and shouldn't do. There's plenty of cases of people who squat arse to grass and are fine. There's plenty of cases for people who, barely squat to parallel and they're also fine. As we always come back to, it depends what your goal is, what your function is, what you're training for, as to which is appropriate for you on the depth point of view. I've had people come to me because they want to squat deeper, because they want to catch their weightlifting lower. But equally, I have clients who want to stop crashing into the bottom of a squat, because that causes them issues when they hit maximum depth. So actually, we're looking to reduce the depth of their squat. Always could just consider what's it for, what's the desired stimulus, and then we can start to have a more informed discussion as to what's right for you.
It's really interesting that you said that both are fine, and it's like you obviously determine what is fine, because at the end of the day, if you're doing a squat for sports performance, at what level do you say, okay, now this is like, so obviously we've spoken there about, say, the knees over toes, like getting right down in a squat to where your hamstrings pretty much touch your calves and you're right down in that position. Now, I was listening to a podcast recently and Ben Patrick, the knees over toe guy, and he was just like, this isn't necessarily there to make the strongest squat. This is what his focus is, building, say, knee health and ultimately a good range of motion in your joints that you can eventually handle. And his methodology is obviously regressing right back to what you can do and then progressing all the way up to what they call the classic knees over toes split squat. Split lunge. I'm just winding you up now, no? And and then obviously when we're talking about the other extreme of then keeping the hips above parallel and then creating power, and it's just like, but then you got on one side of the thing Ben Patrick saying that you jump in for basketball, knees over the toes, and so it really is it is so opinionated that I like the fact, obviously you said there as well, because they're the extremes, that's what gets noticed, and anyone in the middle, the grey zone, which is, we get told to not be in the grey zone because it's boring, it's beige, and just no one likes that. But at the same time, it just means that I think you can have a balanced approach of both. And if you can have a good enough outlook on it, you can understand that maybe some clients will only ever hit parallel, maybe just. And that's because they can't take the time to work on stuff outside of their sessions, or they can't do things to help maybe improve their squat depth. Like, as you said, people come to you to improve their squat depth. But if that person's not competing, and they don't really need to, it's just, it's a nice to have. And I think that's where, I think when you're trying to review your squat, and if you need to go lower or higher or whatever, you need to ask, is what you're currently doing causing you any issues? And if it's not causing you any issues, do you need to go lower, or do you need to keep yourself, ask yourself these questions? And I think that's something that gets forgotten. We look at everyone and say, right, this is what we should do, when it's actually like, what do we need to do?
Exactly. There are no absolutes. And I think, to sort of use those, like the knees over toes guy, and I think probably the counterpoint that people would reference is a guy called Dr. Joel Seaman. He's definitely worth checking out on Instagram. Because
he's got Terry Crews now, hasn't he? So it's like, he's got Terry Crews, and it's like, okay, you've now got someone like him but the thing, sorry, just to quickly riff on that, as soon as you get someone like Terry Crews in, right? So who's been lifting for years and years and years, and obviously jacked to high, like just an all-round, just bigger. He's a man. He's a man's man, right? He's a big man. So you start getting him to do half squats, and he starts saying, "Oh yeah, I feel great doing it." Of course you feel great. You're doing half the range of motion you normally do, and it's just, this is then where now you've got someone of such a prolific, world-known person that anything that he says and that feels good is now going to be, this fire to the, stoking the fire in it. You're just going to boost it. Say, oh, look, here it is, really good. And this is my only issue now with like that side of things, because it's an argument of an opinion. And I know we've both listened to the same podcast about, and how that, I think they both agree that they're just opinions, and that they do feel they have studies and they have things to back up their opinions. But at the end of the day, it is very individual.
Yeah, exactly. So, for those of you who haven't heard of Joel Seaman, he's definitely worth checking out on Instagram for some of the fucking crazy exercises he puts out there. And I think I've heard him speak about it, and he's very willing to admit that he chooses to use extra crazy exercises for publicity, and that he overrepresents those like insane looking things that he does just to basically draw attention to his page.
Can you give one of the examples? Can you give an example?
Look, I saw one where he had a safety bar on his back and also in a trap bar, and he was basically doing a trap bar deadlift and a hands-free safety bar squat at the same time, maybe with some bands on the side with some kettlebells to add extra instability.
So this is why you need to check it out.
Yeah, it's like, this is like the best exercise for forcing your core to brace. It's like, of course it fucking is. You got 6 different loading vectors on your body. He works with quite a lot of NFL players, and a lot of people are like, why does this guy get to train these like elite athletes when he doesn't know what he's talking about? When actually, I think most of his training is actually quite normal and sensible, but people sort of know him for these crazy exercises. And I think his controversial talking point is that he says 90 degrees is where the magic happens, and there's no point going any lower than that. And there is more nuance to it than that. People have sort of pigeonholed into that point of view, when I think he actually has a bit more nuance to him and isn't necessarily so dogmatic. But what we need to consider here is, what's he optimizing for with his athletes? So why is he applying those methods to those situations? And the reality is, he's the strength and conditioning coach for American football players, and he only gets a very limited amount of time to work with them. And the outcomes that he wants are maximal strength gains in minimal time. So he doesn't have extra hours to work on their mobility and do loads of prehab stuff. He's like, I need to get these guys in, out, and stronger as quickly as I can. So him not going below parallel, maybe he doesn't give them the same movement options as squatting arse to grass would do. He doesn't give them the same mobility that, a more long-term health considered approach might do. But in terms of what he needs to do for those athletes, he's decided that that's the most effective way to get them the results that they want. And he gets good results. Like, he still gets a lot of American football players coming to him to get stronger and faster and everything else. So he obviously is doing something right. And you contrast that with Ben Patrick, knees over toes guy, who is working with people to get the opposite. It's almost like long-term knee health, big range of motion, get all your joints to work to pretty extreme ranges compared to most training. But his target metric that he's optimizing for is that. So he's looking to build range of motion. He's looking to increase tissue tolerance. So his approach is very converse, where he'll get people doing 12 weeks of just body weight exercises to improve range of motion and slowly build up the tissue tolerance in, say, the tendons of the knees. If you said to an American football player, yeah, we're going to do 12 weeks of like improving your range of motion before you're going to start adding like serious strength, they'd sack you on the spot. They don't have that time. They don't have that luxury, because they have to balance the rest of their sports specific training around their strength and conditioning. So it's almost like a bit of a non-argument. People, like, they're not both talking about the same situation as to who should squat shallow and who should squat deep. They've got different target markets, different audiences, and that nuance is the whole discussion. Like, why are you squatting in the first place? And then we can have a discussion about what depth is appropriate. And there are no absolutes, because everyone has their own priorities, which we need to be really considerate of before we decree what the right squat depth is.
That's correct. And I think when we think about like that, those ends of the spectrum, and there, as you said, one's working for health, the other one's working for performance. So, and as we say, when you try and train both, forgetting even aesthetics, when you try and train both at the same time, you're not training either. So then you've got athletes coming towards going to Joel Seaman, say, doing these, say, half squats or whatever, but getting the result that they're after. So then understanding why they're essentially like getting the progress is like, because they're doing what's needed for their sport, and it's exactly tailored to that. And I think because of social media, we're seeing two opposing views, and then it's everyone else that puts these arguments together, saying, oh no, we don't need to squat knees over toes, or we need to squat knees over toes. So you're getting these extreme views because it's what gets popularized, as you said. They even said that at the start. But the thing is like, when I heard the interview with Joel Seaman, he's like, me and Ben Patrick, these other toe guys, have a lot of things in common. We agree about most things. And it's just like, so you're literally just one thing that they say is, say, squat depth is that where they both say disagree, but they only disagree because it's for the clientele that they work with. Whereas I reckon if you said, right, okay, put this into the actual practical application of, as you said there, you've got an NFL player that wants to go do body weight movements for 12 weeks. It's like, I ain't got time for that. They haven't got that. And unfortunately, I say unfortunately, it's probably a really good thing that this type of information is available now, because you can reach people younger, which then means that maybe someone that's not quite at the NFL level yet but wants to get there starts to build that tissue tolerance so they can do knees over toes. So by the time they get to the the NFL, they might not even need to do knees over toes anymore, and they've built all this strength, and because they've got good strength and tissue tolerance for their full range. So it's I think information is so important to obviously be out, but because of social media, it gets biased and pigeonholed into, no, this is right, no, this is right. And it's like, but no one's arguing it. You've created this argument unnecessarily.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think, the thing that sort of encapsulates all of this is there's always trade-offs to be made. So in a perfect world, of course, you would have maximum range of motion and be fully strong through all of it, and also be fucking strong at the same time. But the reality is there's opportunity cost. So with a limited budget of resource, whether it's time, energy, recovery, you have to prioritize what you as an individual or your athletes as an individual need most. And for those NFL players, strength and performance is the priority at the expense of other things. Whereas for Ben Patrick and his audience, the priority is knee health. That's what he's so passionate about because he had so many knee injuries. So they would prioritize their knee health and longevity over putting on maximal strength in the shortest period of time.
Yeah, and I think obviously we've been discussing now obviously two extreme views, but when we want to start putting this into, say, a practical application of like you guys, the listeners, and like what you do isn't obviously, as we always say, like what are you training for and how are you training? Like why do you need to squat? If you need to squat, then what's going to benefit you the most? So I think what would be really good is maybe if we break down like the whole squat from even approaching the bar to the performing of the squat, what it looks like, and then going through. So I'll note down a couple of points which be really good to maybe get your thoughts on. But I think first things first, so if we talk about, say, just loading in general, okay? So as I think most of us know, we can load a squat in multiple ways, and we can also do a bodyweight squat. That's a form of load, right? But it's just at its bare minimum. Now, obviously, we as we say, it depends on what your needs are to depend on what type of squat you need to do. And is there anything in particular that you see that maybe people jump the gun? Like I mentioned earlier about people thinking, right, back squat is the squat that they need to do.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly it, isn't it? Like everyone thinks that they have to back squat. As always, you need to consider why you're squatting in the first place and what's the stimulus you're trying to elicit. And then you can select the most appropriate squat for that. So if you're a weightlifter, then front squatting is going to be more relevant than back squatting. If you're a powerlifter, then back squatting is definitely going to be part of your program. But if you're just squatting for life, maybe body weight's fine, maybe a goblet's better. And yeah, sort of everything in and around that.
Exactly. So, but the reason why I wanted to kind of get onto that bit is because I think when the next point I want to kind of get to is like the bar path, because I guess when the reason why I say bar path and like there, because it depends if you're doing a barbell squat or say when bar path, I'm meaning your center of gravity. So where is that center of gravity going in relation? So obviously, with something like the deadlift, the weight is loaded in front of you. So you're constantly thinking about keeping that bar close and as close to that midline as possible to keep it as strong as possible. You gave that point, which I found really fascinating, that if it was just a tiny bit away, it was like loads. I can't remember what was that? Do you remember it?
It's nearly twice as much force required to lift a deadlift if it's like an inch out in front in terms of force, even though the mass of the bar is the same.
Yeah. So, and also is when I think about bar path as well, it's like it's amazing when you think about where the bar is placed. So, for instance, I'm a low bar squatter, so the bar is actually lower down my back, and then I'm more leaned over. More leaned over? That's not the word.
Yeah.
Is it leaned over?
I'd say leaned over.
Yeah. Okay. More leaned over. So, and I'm then loading obviously different muscles. I'm loading the same muscles, but maybe I'm favouring them in different ways. What are maybe some of your thoughts to do with like the bar path, and maybe let's dive a bit deeper into that.
Yeah, so the principle of bar path is essentially your foot or your feet are your points of contact with the world. So your center of balance is the middle of your foot, and that's where you want most of the weight to be. As soon as the mass of your body plus the bar is away from that center of balance, the middle of your foot, you build a lever arm. So like the classic way to think about this is if you hold a dumbbell at your shoulder, it feels light. If you hold it at arm's length, it feels really heavy because there's now a lever arm around your shoulder, and the length of your arm is making it feel heavier because of that leverage. So in squatting, we want the mass, like the center of mass, to be over the center of balance. And if you've got a heavy barbell, that will represent the majority of the center of mass. So we're always looking for the end of that barbell to stay over the middle of your foot. And as soon as it starts to drift away from that, we're building a lever arm, which we don't want or need. That's going to make the bar feel heavier than it actually is. Or the weight will feel greater than the mass. So it doesn't matter what style of squat you're doing. This principle is the same, whether it's low bar, high bar, front squat, overhead squat. We always want the end of that barbell to look over the feet. And it's a great thing to look out for from a coaching point of view. If you're side on from somebody squatting and you see that barbell start to drift forwards towards the toes or even out over in front of the toes, that's a really good clue as to where somebody might be getting back pain from, because they've just got so much more force to deal with, and it will quite often manifest in the lower back because the fulcrum, the sort of lever point, moves higher up the body as it tries to bring the bar back into control.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about that is because whenever I wear weightlifting shoes, I'm always a lot more toe dominant because obviously my heels are elevated and I don't necessarily need that extra ankle flexion for my squat. It actually causes me to squat. I was watching a side view of myself doing it the other day in lifters. So I was thinking maybe lifters is what I'm missing. And I did it and I was like, Jesus, I'm just all in my toes. Because it's just one, I've obviously been training without lifters and wearing Converse and flat shoes. But it's funny because it's a bit of kit which is right. This is going to make your squat better because it's going to give you extra stability. That point you've got the elevated heel, but sometimes it just doesn't help. And now the reason why I was kind of wanting to go into that is because the next point I kind of want to touch on is about like the tripod foot. So the 3 points of contact. Now, when we say tripod, your heel, your little toe, and your big toe, basically that sort of area, we want to make sure we have connection with the floor. Now, I think it gets bastardized when people shout, like say, right, heels, all in your heels, or like push more through the toes because people are leaning back too much. And it's a dynamic movement. So there's going to be points in time where you're going to be more loaded through the heel, more loaded through the toe. But understand that when you're essentially at probably your end range, so wherever that is, that's the moment you're going to want that bar loaded over the middle of the foot, so the middle of a triangle. It's going to be the strongest position going to be possible. And then you're driving up through those 3 points, rather than just 1 point, because then 1 point, even if you start straight, it means you're going to start deviating away out of that bar path because you're then dominating, say, just your heels or just your toes. And I think any weightlifters all know that, or anyone that's lifted with a barbell, if you're too toe dominant or anything like that, you fall forward and I say you collapse. It's just not a good time.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think in a lot of fitness courses, they'll coach people to put weight into their heels, and they're almost preempting somebody's predisposition to prefer loading the toes. But that's not always the case. Some people do overload their heels and their toes will come off. So that's why I like the tripod foot as the principle of where your weight should be. Like trying to keep some weight in all 3 points of contact throughout the lift means that you have the most stable base to push from. And I really like the way you articulated that about it being a dynamic movement, and it's not going to be 33.3% in each of those 3 points of contact at all points through the lift. It will slightly move, for complex mechanical reasons. But the principle is that they should all be on the floor. And this guy, Gary Ward, I really like, who talks about this well, where he says, if you lose one of those 3 points of contact, you've gone from a tripod to an ice skate, which is a lot less stable, a lot harder to balance and create stability from. So look out for that when you're coaching as well. Is somebody's big toe coming off the ground, or they're rolling in so their pinky toe is coming off, or they're rocking forward so their heel comes off. Like anytime that happens, the stability of that foot is massively diminished, which can cause all sorts of problems upstream. And when you're squatting yourself, it's something to focus on, to just check in with yourself. Do I feel some pressure going through all those 3 points? And if not, what can I do to try and rectify it?
So it's funny because I have a similar sort of analogy as well, where I say if you want to push something over and you've got a column, a brick wall and a pyramid, what's going to be easy to push over? The column, right? The one thing. Then you got the wall. So you want to be the most stable thing you can be to be the strongest you can possibly be. And it's funny you say this because it's like, where obviously recently I've been prepping for a powerlifting competition. So I've been squatting 3 times a week, and so frequencies picked up a lot from obviously 0. So I'm now realizing as well where I was doing, say, bad habits. And we had a squat assessment recently, which was really interesting because little things from squatting to even just sitting there. Now we talk about a tripod foot. When I was squatting the other week, I was going down in my warm-up sets and I was noticing that all my weight was through my heel and my little toe, so like the outside of the feet. And I was like, "Fuck, my knees are hurting." Like, why? This is the whole point of warm up sets, and this is why it is important to warm up with the movement itself, and not necessarily progress to the weight, like progressing up in weight until you feel comfortable with that weight. Beyond just, okay, it feels good in my back, is in like, cool, how does this movement feel? Do I feel ready to move to the next weight? So I was going through the lifts. It was just 60 kilos, and I was just like, why are my feet? Like, why am I getting knee pain? And I thought, oh, fuck it. So then I didn't listen to my own advice. I went up to 100 kilos, as you do, because that's my next step. And I'm doing it, I'm like, I'm still getting knee pain. And then I realised I'm feeling all the weight to the outside of my feet. As soon as I then push my big toe down, so I went down don't get me wrong, I go down with all 3 feet, but then I push out through just the outside. All 3 feet, yeah, well, yeah. My 2 feet, but the 3 points. So I go down with all 3 points connected, but then I push up through the 2 points. Now, as soon as I then started pushing through my big toe as well at the bottom, so I had to really consciously think about push through the big toe, the knee pain completely disappeared. And this was then because I was then loading myself correctly, even though I know how to do this, where I was obviously, I've built up a lot of tension recently and, just all these other little issues, that it's then caused me to squat different and has then caused me an impingement elsewhere. And it's funny because even when you know how to squat, as I think we touched on earlier, like you still fuck up, you still get it wrong because again, we're not the same human every day. We have different life stresses, different things placed on our bodies, which means we're going to be a bit tighter in a new way on a new day. So that's always something to, like, if someone always say squats down with like with me, but it might be just because I've been doing a lot of manual labor and I'm just quite tight at the moment. So.
Exactly that. Yeah, that's why it's always good to check back with the principles to make sure that you're ticking them all off.
So I guess the next bit is, as we've now got the full connection on your foot, so then we need to start thinking about back position, right? And then about like where the weight's loaded, how we're staying tight in that position. Are we hyperextending or more?
Yeah. So this is a good one to talk about because it's very related to the neutral spine discussion we had about the deadlift. And the way I talk about it is a controlled back position rather than, a dead straight, perfect neutral spine. And the principle here is you don't want excessive flexion or extension, but some flexion or extension is fine provided it's controlled. So what we're looking to achieve with back position is not to have a huge change in position, especially under load. As if it's uncontrolled, then 1 or 2 vertebrae might be bearing the brunt of that movement, which is not generally what people are looking to train in the squat. However, some spinal motion is necessary and is required for a lot of squat variations, and especially for squatting to depth. So if you're looking to squat as low as you can, this relates to a later point, which we might as well do now, about buttwink. There has to be some flexion for you to achieve maximal depth. So if your pelvis didn't posteriorly rotate and your spine didn't slightly flex, you would not be able to squat arse to grass. Basically, if you think about your pelvis as, well, it's obviously the home where the ball and socket joint of the hip is. And if your pelvis stayed square and you squatted arse to grass, your hips are going below your knees. If your pelvis stayed square, your thigh bone would run into the front of the pelvis. So your pelvis has to posteriorly rotate. If your pelvis posteriorly rotates, so that analogy of your pelvis being a bucket, the bucket is now pouring water out the back. That's posterior rotation. If that's happening, the spine also has to flex for you to stay balanced. If your spine stayed perfectly neutral in relation to that pelvis, you'd be doing like a limbo, like lean back. So buttwink is referring to that posterior rotation of the pelvis, and it's thought of as wrong or bad. You can't squat to depth without some form of that. And what's happening when people look like they don't have a buttwink is that all that flexion is essentially happening in a really small spot, usually somewhere in the lumbar spine. So you've got a hypermobility in 1 or 2 joints in the back that makes it look like they've got a straight back and a pelvis that doesn't rotate, but actually it's still happening, but just all in one place. So I would suggest that that's actually more injurious. Like, you're more likely to hurt yourself because you're putting all of that motion through one joint rather than spreading it evenly between the pelvis and the spine.
I think this comes down to, again, the statement of why do you need to squat low and how low do you need to go? Because, again, if someone's getting that much butt wink, a lot from what I've seen is because they have this predetermined idea of what the squat should look like. And because, say, their ankles don't have that room for the knees to track forward, they essentially collapse at the back and then start to keep going down. So they essentially turn into this like ball at the bottom compared to, say, that relatively neutral, say, loaded spine. And it's funny because they're then forcing themselves into this position that they think they should get to, then causes then the butt wink. And normally it's when they then got load on their back. So my question to you then is, so if we are loaded and there's butt wink with control, is that always a bad thing? No, not that you said it was a bad. Sorry, I didn't say that right. Is that a bad thing? And so an example is when I watch myself squat, especially when I get to the higher loads, I do have a slight bit of butt wink.
Yeah.
And I have got a busted back at the moment, but that's just a coincidence, right? So is that an issue when you do have loads, especially so using me as an example, who's a low bar squatter, so the bar sits a little bit lower down, so I'm more posteriorly loaded. And at the bottom of my squat, this is not like a real classic butt wink where you see loads, but there is some tuck under. Right?
Yeah.
Is that a problem for me, and has that fucked up my back?
No. Well, maybe. It's not a problem. Like I said, it has to happen. For you to achieve a certain amount of depth, there has to be some posterior rotation of the pelvis. But the caveat with this, like all movements, is that all movements can be too much, and if they are uncontrolled, then they can be dangerous. But that doesn't mean the movement in and of itself is dangerous. Like the classic example here is elbow extension, like extending your elbow. No one thinks that's dangerous, but you can overextend an elbow. So does that mean you shouldn't do handstands? You shouldn't do jerks and extend your elbow? Of course not. But it can go too far and it can be uncontrolled and therefore lead to issues. The same goes for posterior rotation of the pelvis and butt wink. It can be too much, it can be uncontrolled, which can lead to issues, but it in and of itself is not a dangerous thing, and it's a natural movement. If you look at a baby squat, they naturally will do that and their back will round slightly to get into their sitting position. So yeah,
it's brilliant. The other day I come upstairs and Chloe was saying, she goes, "Daddy, do this," and I was like, "What are you doing?" And so she's doing like a sumo squat. I was like, "What are you doing?" Because I'm doing Zoom PT still and stuff. So she walks in, she sees people, and I say, "Oh, look, they're squatting, they're lunging, they're doing X, Y, Z," and she's just like, "Oh no," just walk upstairs, and it amazes me at how just like perfect a kid's squat is before you've had life fucking you up and making you do shit you shouldn't do. That you're naturally made to just move in this beautiful way. And also it's funny because a little side note of like going away from squatting necessarily, but even like deadlifting, like watching them pick up, is they don't necessarily have the most neutral spine, anything like that, but they're tight. I watch her lift up a couple of like 8 kilo kettlebell just, and it's just like, and she's fine with it, she carries it. I'm just like, Jesus, like it's such a natural thing to do these movements. And I think again, this kind of goes to like say with the social media side of stuff, or what we constantly see of this is right, no, this is right. It doesn't leave room for exploration. And I think a style of deadlifting I've been playing around with recently is having my shoulders pulled forward into protraction and creating tension from that. And I've been feeling so much stronger than trying to keep them locked back. And for me, I've always had this like shoulders always need to be locked back and down and stuff, and which is a good strong position, because at the end of the day you're in this contracted position, but you're forcing yourself into somewhere, so the shoulders are going to go forward at some point. So when I thought about it, I was like, well, why not put them forward but contract them and keep them there so they don't move? It's been how I felt has just been again, I've then fucked up my back, but I don't know what the issue is here. But it's amazing that when we don't follow necessarily what everyone says and find what feels good for you, it's amazing at what you can discover. And I think people are just worried about that self-discovery. and because they're looking different to everyone else. And when you got a point?
I was just going to say the whole notion of form is pretty much an opinion. It's a construct that, like, the principle for lifting heavy is you need to create stability. So you need to find a position to lock yourself in so that you can generate maximum force to lift a weight. But what position you lock yourself in is kind of up for debate. As long as you're not moving in an uncontrolled way through weak areas of your body, then you can choose where it is. And the protractor shoulder in deadlifting is a classic example, in that people think of the safe and proper position of a shoulder as scapula retracted and depressed, like shoulders back and down. That's where they should be. That's where they're strongest. But if you're pulling, 250 kilos off the floor, do you think your small shoulder stabilizing muscles that retract and depress your scapula are able to withstand 250 kilos of force? Of course they're not. So the shoulders are going to come forward. So you might as well stabilize and brace them in a position that they're going to be in, rather than having them yanked there without control, under load. And the same goes for neutral spine. It's sort of been positioned as this absolute must have for lifting. You must have a neutral spine. But then, as you said, Chloe lifts stuff off the floor perfectly fine out of neutral, and she's strong out of neutral. And this is actually knees over toes guys talks about this well. Stuff like Jefferson curls, you're strengthening your ability to deal with those movement variations. Whereas if you only ever train in neutral, you're actually limiting your capacity to express your strength, because you only ever express it around that position. And sport and life are not done in neutral spine. Your spine is always moving. So it always depends on what you're training for. If you're training to compete in a powerlifting competition, then it's all about maximum load. But if you're training for life, then adding in those movement options and variation about neutral is actually going to give you more choice and resilience against the day-to-day demands of that your body faces.
Yeah, and I guess it does come down to the thing of, when you are then experimenting with these different positions, take notes, not just of the movement itself and maybe where your strength is or whatever, but how you feel a day after, how you feel a couple of days after, or how you feel like going back into that next session or something. Like, the more data you have on movement mechanics that are personalized to you, the better of a picture you can create, a customized thing, and we stop pigeonholing ourselves into other people's boxes. And that's sometimes appropriate, but not at this moment in time. So when we're talking about different types of movement mechanics, I think a really obvious one, which is glaring, which, 5 episodes in, we spoke at length about this, and I know it's one of your favorite topics, about knees in. So valgus knee. So when you see people squatting in the knees, buckle in. Anyone that's been on social media and watch any weightlifting, you're going to see the two extremes. You are going to see a lot like the Chinese, their knees smashing in and come straight back out, and they're lifting loads. And then you're also seeing the complete opposite, where knees are stuck out in a position. And a lot of the time I've noticed is, I don't know if this is just what I've biased my views on, but you see a lot of Americans that squat, when I'm talking about the heavy squats. I don't know, just different parts of the world doing things differently. That's because obviously it's going to be how we're influenced by information told to us by coaches. So obviously I know what your thoughts are. Let's maybe discuss knees in, knees out.
Right. The big one. So one of the main reasons I wanted to create this podcast was just so I could record an episode on knee valgus to refer people to, rather than having the same conversation over and over again. But yeah, please do check out episode 5 for a real deep discussion on
It'll be linked in the description box below.
Because we go really deep into it. And where to start? Like I said about neutral spine and buttwink, the principle here is the movement smooth and controlled, or is it jerky and uncontrolled? That applies to all motions. Jerky and uncontrolled poses a level of risk. However, for knee valgus, it's a normal, natural position, and it is required to maximally recruit your glutes. So a lot of education systems out there will promote pushing your knees out as you squat, but it's kind of like putting weight into your heels, that cue we talked about earlier, and you're preempting somebody's dysfunction when it might not necessarily be the case. And I actually have loads of people come to me because they've given themselves knee pain or other issues by excessively driving their knees out. And it actually pairs very well with what we were saying about the tripod foot. If you shove your knees out, you quite often lose that big toe point of contact on the floor, which can lead to other whole host of issues. So the short story here is that from a bone alignment or knee tracking point of view, from an injury prevention point of view, from a performance optimization point of view, some valgus is required. Your knees will have to twitch in at some point. And episode 5, we go into exactly why that's the case. Over avoiding it can be deleterious, as I just said. You can get knee wear and tear. You struggle to load your glutes, which can lead to lower back pain. And you also lose strength, which, as Rob mentioned just there, is why if you look up any of the heaviest squats ever, heaviest weightlifting lifts ever, they will always express some valgus. What I'm not saying is the more valgus, the better. As with everything, there is a Goldilocks amount of just right. But depending on how flexible you are, that knee, like you see people knees literally touch. Like Tia Claire Toomey actually has a huge amount of knee valgus when she squats, and she's bloody strong. But then equally, you see some powerlifters doing huge back squats, and it's like a subtle twitch of, you know, a couple of centimeters. But it does always happen in the heavy squats because it is optimal from a performance point of view. It's also optimal from a joint health point of view to be more toward, like, had to express some valgus rather than varus. So varus is the opposite when you're shoving your knees out. And if you get a knee joint in your hand, you can actually see how the grooves of the patella line up with the femur. And when you shove the knee out into varus, the bones grind, the meniscus gets compressed on one side, and it's just obviously horrible. But for some reason, people tend towards this because they feel more stable, they feel their glutes more. But as we go into in episode 5, that is misleading and not actually better for you.
I think once we'd had the discussion and stuff like that, and I really started to understand more about knee valgus and know that it isn't the devil, I actually started to realize that when I was squatting and hitting my bottom position, however, and then the knees coming in and me actually pushing my knees back out, I felt comfortable with that it then started helping my squat because it was a natural thing. And because I was, before that, I'd be maybe trying to keep my knees out. So then because then they twitch in, I was already then pushing them back out anyway. But because I was thinking, oh no, my knees are going in, I was forcing against what was supposed to happen. But as soon as I let what happened happen by them coming in and me pushing them out, it then started to feel smooth. And it started to mean, like I say, in better positions. And it also meant I actually felt my glutes switch on and actually drive me out the hole into a form of extension. Because it's like when I hit the bottom and the body wants to, when you see heavy loads and someone's not necessarily staying tight, you see the whole body want to kind of collapse inwards. And that can happen in the upper body, that can happen in the knees, everything. And that, I think, is where people go, oh, knee valgus is bad, because they're seeing uncontrolled movement. And normally when you see someone's knees going in and they're doing it badly, you can also see their upper body is collapsed in, everything is collapsed. So they have no control of that range. Whereas, say, when I watch myself squat and I go down and I hit the bottom and I see my knees coming in and out, I now don't say, oh, I need to work on that. I'm just like, oh, cool. I'm looking at my total body positioning and making sure that I'm staying controlled and stable throughout my range of motion. And that obviously like goes back into the buttwink point as well. When I'm only hitting that bottom position, I might go a bit too deep for a low bar squatter. But I don't like putting the brakes on too early because then it feels like I'm also draining energy unnecessarily. So I'm utilizing my range of motion that I have and my end ranges to get myself out, which is when you see weightlifters and, you know, when they do the double bounce out the hole and because they don't get it straight away. So they hit the bottom of their squat and they might not be able to drive straight out. So they drop down again. They use that bounce, that stretch reflex and get themselves out. And essentially, you know, they're doing what they can to get the task done because that is the purpose of their squat.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So a couple of things in that are really great. One is the control point. It has to be controlled. So even if you slightly round your back, like when people get their 1 rep max front squat, there's usually back
Oh,
rounding.
God, yeah, always. Yeah.
So like what's going on there? Like you're loading your back, you're stretching those muscles to help you get the bar up. And if we think about the descent of a squat, what we're trying to do is load the muscles, which are then going to fire us back up and out of the bottom. So everything needs to lengthen, like elastic bands. Our muscles are basically elastic bands. They stretch under load so they can then shorten. So if we're shoving our knees out, we're blocking the capacity of our glutes to lengthen. So like you said, you let those knees come in a little bit, you let the glutes lengthen, which then gives them the opportunity to shorten and stand you up. And that's exactly what's happening in their double bounce for weightlifters. They bounce once, they haven't got quite enough stretch reflex, so they bounce again to re-stretch all those muscles to then fire them up and out of the hole. And if you're constantly shoving those knees out, you're blocking that stretch reflex in the glutes, which are the biggest, strongest muscles in the body. So you're missing out on a huge key team player in Operation Stand Up.
So my thoughts, and I want to see what you thought. I never actively think knees in. So I don't go down squatting with my knees in. Just to be clear, this is the thing. I break down my squat for you. Is that I stand in a position that's comfortable, normally just outside hip width for me, maybe a tiny bit further out, toes ever so slightly turned out, and I stay tight. And then basically wherever my legs want to go, they go. So rather than forcing knees out or knees in, that again, I think the really important bit I want to make sure that there is, I'm not forcing it. Because as soon as we force positions, as you mentioned there, is when you then start lacking control, because you're now taking yourself somewhere you shouldn't be and forcing you, and that you're not allowing the body to flow, basically, because that's what it is, right? We're no matter what we're doing, however tight we are, we're going through a state of flow, whether that's squatting, deadlifting, whatever. We're moving through space and time. So the reason why I wanted to kind of move on to this is because it kind of links into our last point of not all squats look the same, but kind of there is principles to squatting, and there are, say, classic, things that if you're seeing this happening, then you might be not loading this or that. And there are, as you said, there are principles to squatting that we all kind of want to follow, which we've been discussing this whole time. But is there anything in particular, because at the end of the day, as you mentioned earlier, I think no one has a symmetrical squat. We don't. No. And is that even something that we want? Do we want a symmetrical squat?
In a perfect world, yes. But like you say, no one has a perfect squat. And I just want to pick up on one thing you said there around principles and cues and knees in. Some people cue knees in, like Chinese weightlifters are famous because that's actually a cue they use to drive the knees in to maximize
on the way down.
Reflex. Yes, I believe so. But yeah, they're essentially maximizing that knee valgus to get the most stretch reflex. But because it's controlled, it's okay. And the thing you said that I wanted to just re-emphasize around principles, what we've tried to do here with the principles of a squat are give you things that are always true. So like bar path, the principle of bar path is always present. So it's always going to be better to keep that over the middle of your center of balance. The tripod foot, that's always true. The control of the back position, not a specific back position, is always true. And we're not wanting you to come away with these are the cues that I should always use with every athlete. It's just what cues do I need to achieve those principles given the position we're starting from. So for somebody, it might be appropriate to cue knees in. It might be appropriate to cue knees out, depending what's in front of you. But we're always just trying to come back to these core principles. Like, am I seeing almost like this checklist? And if not, what do I need to do to get this person to cover this checklist? The rule is always as few cues as possible. If someone has a good squat without you telling them anything, just sit down, stand up, then have at it. Like Rob said, a fluid, flowing movement is always better. Like the more conscious you are, the more disjointed the movement becomes and the less efficient it is. So if it is as simple as sit down, stand up, then that's fine. But depending on what your body naturally tends towards, you might need to intervene with some specific cues to bring people back towards this checklist. but as few as possible is always the goal in coaching.
So just a quick disclaimer, if you're going to do any of this with clients or yourself, experiment at body weight and work your way up. Don't go and load up your heavier squat and then drive your knees in and see what happens. Sure. Just maybe next time you're squatting or you're with a client, say, let them squat and just see what happens. As we say, see what the body does. And then when you do start loading it, is it going to be that you actually their knees are now coming in, and now because you know that's not necessarily an issue because it's under control, now does their strength go up? So this is the thing, when we start to experiment, as I mentioned earlier, and we dive into different things, we can really start to understand how individual we all are. And as Ash said, and then I said, just about principles, we just want to make sure we're following the right kind of path. But just like a tree, right? It's a big tree trunk and it has many different avenues off of it, right? You do your own little bit and then come back to the main road and then go off elsewhere. That's the thing. It's just like we want to experiment on ourselves and then also look at the person in front of you and tailor it to them. Don't tailor it just to what your squat is, because you're probably built differently. I'm built very differently to my, say, 50-year-old client. That's a woman. We're two different people. So I'm not going to tell her to squat how I'm going to squat. So, but we follow the same principles. But is there anything in particular that, especially when it comes to squatting, that you see? Like I know when I've seen people squatting and they then get the rotation on the way up. Like that's obviously now we're going into a different plane of motion. So normally it's just straight up and down, but now you're adding rotation into the mix. Is that always a bad thing? Because obviously, as we said, I know this always, it depends, but it's because we're not most likely going to be squatting symmetrically. I guess if we've got some rotation in our movement, or maybe the hips raising first compared to then anything else, is that something that we should be addressing to fix?
Yeah, good question. And it depends is always going to be the answer. Yeah. But I think the way to think about it is it's not ideal, but it's not necessarily a problem. So as we said, no one has a perfect symmetrical squat. There's always like quirks going on, and symmetry is great in that in a perfect world, it would split the workload evenly between sides of the body and the various muscle groups to be most efficient. But the reality is, depending on our habits, like the position we spend most of our time in, any injuries we've had, the body always has these quirks and, in air quotes, dysfunctions away from optimal mechanics. However, it's only a problem when it's a problem. So you can basically crack on until it rears its ugly head. But if you're seeing something major, which you can foresee will lead to problems later down the line, like somebody has a huge rotation or a huge favoring of one side versus the other, you can guess that will lead to an overuse injury on that side if the volume and intensity of the program progresses too quickly. That's a very likely outcome. So you can get ahead of that and try to bring yourself back to a more balanced mechanic by bringing up the left leg, so the weak leg, or blocking that rotation, or training it out to be a better distributed workload for the whole body versus having one part of the body do a huge amount more. And I think the easiest way to think about it is from a performance point of view. If you're squatting 200 kilos and one leg is way stronger than the other, and you can see that the mass, like somebody's head is way over to one side, the hips are way over to one side. Of that 200 kilos, the right leg might be squatting 140 of it and the left leg just 60 of it. If you're looking to build strength and add more weight to that squat, is it going to be easier to get the right leg squatting more than 140 kilos, or is it going to be easier to get the left leg squatting more than 60 kilos? The left leg has way more room in its strength potential, which is way easier, lower hanging fruits to gain than getting that right leg even stronger. It's already like unbelievably strong if your right leg is moving 140 kilos of mass. So it's not just from an injury point of view, it's also from a performance point of view. Are there easy, quicker wins by getting a fairer distribution of workload across the body, across sides, across muscle groups, that will help you perform better without just progressively overloading the same movement, and addressing some imbalances or movement mechanics.
Yeah, I think as well it does come down to, if we're talking about performance as well, when you start to get heavier, at the end of the day, things are going to look different. Like, you don't want them to look too far different from the as we say, the principles of a squat. You want to try and keep as close to what your 60 kilo squat to your 200 kilo squat, because at the end of the day, if they vary too much, like as you say, if you're really balanced in a 60 kilo squat, but then start to become unbalanced in a 200 kilo squat, then you need to ask yourself, at what point do you start to shift? And then ask yourself, why are you shifting? Because I know from personal experience, as I start to get heavier, I feel my right leg start to dominate more in a squat. So I won't necessarily, to the naked eye, you don't necessarily see that unless you're trained. But generally, I'm actually pushing more through my right than on my left. And then I push into it and I come across. But my actual squat looks relatively up and down. But it's then those, I say, the slight little nuances of like where that weight's being distributed, which then in turn is going to cause me issues down the line, which, having a bit of a problem at the moment has definitely probably partly to do with that. And I think when you are performing any exercise, sticking with the squat, obviously, when we're squatting, if you don't go heavy and actually start to see these things, you won't know. And the thing is, all well and good staying in your comfort zone and squatting 60 kilos when you're actually capable of squatting 100, 140, whatever. But if you never go away from 60 kilos and stay where you feel comfortable and safe, and you can keep your perfect thing, if you're trying to get stronger, you have to keep going up. And when you start seeing these little discrepancies, because when you said there about when it's wrong, it's wrong. But it's like, at what point is it wrong though? Because if, for instance, with me, as I said, I can feel my hips rise slightly with a squat first coming out the hole, and then I bring myself through and up, and I feel completely fine doing that. Now, is staying further forward a good thing for me? Probably, because the bar path will probably be straighter. But I'm feeling stronger because I can then again utilize my hips. So is it a problem? I guess only if I then get injured, which I have. So it's a problem.
You answered your own question there, I think.
I know, in a roundabout way. So is there anything else in particular that you want to run through? Maybe give the listeners a bit of a checklist of some of our run-throughs and a bit of an overview.
Yeah, so I guess the simplest way to think about your squat is, does it feel good? Like, is it causing you problems? Have you got injured? Are there niggles that are getting worse over time versus just going away? Compare that with, are you making progress? So are your numbers going up? If it feels good and you're making progress, then I just say crack on sensibly. Like, don't try and layer on, as we've talked about in the past, like doing too much too soon is basically how all injuries arise. But if you are feeling good and things are going well, then just steadily build until something says that you should think about it, really, which people are probably surprised for me to say. The other checklist is definitely add in some lunges. Of course, I'm going to say that. But lunges or split squats are probably my top tip for accessorizing your squats, just because what I see for people with injuries in the squats is generally that imbalance. Like, one leg will be stronger than the other. They're generally quite poor from a stability point of view. So whether it's the foot or the hip, they're not getting that stability stimulus that you do get from single leg exercises. So adding in the single leg work, adding in different planes of motion to challenge the joints to work in different directions. It asks different questions of your muscles, and all the stability gains and the movement options that you're building will benefit your squat and increase your joint health and mobility over time. Only if you're like peaking for a powerlifting competition would I look to dial that stuff down. For almost everyone in every other situation, I think that's a good idea. Those are probably the main things to put on the checklist. Don't want too much to overcomplicate things. And
I think just to add on to that point of the lunges and the split squats is to not be afraid to do more reps on your weaker side. I think that's we're again talking about that pigeonhole where we're stuck in this corner of you must do 8 to 10 reps or you must do on both legs. It's like, yeah, but then your right leg's going to get even stronger. And it's, and I've been a culprit of that. And it's like, when you start to understand that maybe you might need to do 30 reps on one leg and say 10 reps on the other leg because you want it to catch up quicker, then that's the way it is. And also, again, the same with loading. If you're doing a single loaded thing, you're doing it on one side, you might not be able to hold, say, 12 kilos on both sides. So you might actually have to have a lighter load or even body weight on one side. So it's just, you have to take it as it is and assess the issue that you want to try and sort out and correct, and then try and get yourself back to being as symmetrical as possible. So
yeah, we have an episode on muscle imbalances where we talk about that, which is worth looking up.
It'll be in the show notes. I'll find it. So Ash, do you want to take us out of this one?
Yeah, I think so. If you did the intro, I think I'll do the outro. So I guess the takeaways today, as always, we promote the message of getting very clear on why you're squatting, like what are you squatting for? Answer that question, and then a lot of the downstream decisions will be made for you. In terms of the critical features, we've got our list of bar path, tripod foot, controlled back position, considering your knee tracking, buttwink's okay, and look out for your symmetry, hip shifts or hikes. A little bit's okay, but if it's causing you problems, then it's not. As simple as that. Hope you enjoyed the discussion on depth, and that shedded some light on the fact that there's no absolute right or wrong when it comes to depth. Just consider what's appropriate for you. And as always, lunges are king. So even if you're squatting, get some lunges in there. Thank you very much for your time, guys. We really enjoyed this one. Let us know if you enjoy these sort of bumper episode deep dives. We're obviously just trying to serve you as best we can, but I think the squat is something that, everyone talks about from lots of different angles. So we wanted to give you our take on it. If you know somebody who's interested in squats, please do share this episode with them. Growing the show is really important to us, as we want to help as many people as we can. As always, a review on Apple Podcasts, 5 stars preferably, and a nice little comment will make our day. And get in touch if you have any other topics you'd like us to discuss or cover. We will be doing another Q&A episode soon. So just send over any comments to @lunge.lift on Instagram, or on our website there's a contact us part, lungeandlift.com.
And a download.
And the download of the 4 best deadlift accessories you're not currently doing. Definitely check that out. Thanks as ever, guys, and we look forward to speaking with you next week.
Thank you very much for your time.